Phase 1 in the evolution of consciousness. The formation of the ego, or subjective consciousness. The development of human consciousness, according to the theory of evolution of consciousness, hereafter referred to as tech, unfolds in 4 phases. The first 2 phases represent the development of subjective consciousness, and the latter 2 represent the development of objective consciousness. We now continue with the explanation of the first phase in the evolution of human consciousness. This phase begins with a disintegrated psyche and the awakening of subjective consciousness, i.e., the ego. The goal of consciousness in this phase is for the ego to recognize the other parts of the psyche, the relational, emotional, mental, active, and sensory components, and to bring them under its control. In other words, the journey begins with a fragmented psyche and an undeveloped ego, and it aims to reach a stage where the ego is aware of itself and its surroundings, and is capable of governing the other psychological parts, at which point we can speak of a formed personality. At the beginning, there is psyche, fragmented, colorful, a mosaic of emotions, instincts, impulses, thoughts, and desires, with no center, no I. This is not a personality, but psychic substance. There is no structure, no internal hierarchy, no one to give orders, and no one to follow them. Like a room full of children, with no adult. Each part cries out, "I'm in charge. I have the right. I am the truth." And in that chaos, the person reacts, experiences, suffers, desires, but doesn't know why. He thinks he is that desire. He thinks he is that fear. He believes, "This is me." But the self is not yet there. Tech does not see this phase as a disorder, but as the beginning of forming an integrated personality. The person is present, but not yet assembled. Like a car on an assembly line, it has wheels, a body, perhaps even an engine, but no steering wheel, no control system, no ego. What does no ego mean in tech? In this phase, there is no center that integrates the parts of the psyche. Each part, relational, emotional, mental, active, sensory, and even the primitive ego, acts for itself. The psyche is its stage, but not its creation. The person does not act, he is acted through. There is no subject, only automatism. Everything that is experienced is taken as truth. Each psychological part, when activated, takes control. And consciousness. It has not yet developed the ability to say, "I want to see what's happening." In this phase, there is no distance, no inner observer, no choice, and therefore, no responsibility, not because the person is bad, but because they are not yet capable of choosing. Consciousness at this stage is like a light without a lens. It glows, but doesn't focus. Whatever it illuminates becomes a picture of reality. How does the change begin? In tech, the ego is not a villain. It is an architect. And one day, somewhere between pain and repetition, between chaos and the longing for stability, a center begins to form. At first, it's just a faint attempt. What if this isn't true? What if I don't have to react? What if I am more than this feeling? This is the moment when the ego is born. From that point on, consciousness slowly begins to distinguish parts of itself. It sees that the instinct wants food, but that doesn't necessarily mean hunger. It sees that the emotion seeks attention, but it doesn't always need to be followed. It hears the thought shouting, "Nobody loves me," but realizes it might be lying. That is the first step toward integration, according to tech. Phase 1 is the foundation. Without it, there's no ground upon which the ego can be built. There is no room for discipline, no space for responsibility, no capacity for choice. Consciousness at this stage operates similarly to that of animals. Animals also strive to meet the needs of their bodies. They bond. They even think in patterns. but they do not have a subjective consciousness that says, "This is me." And yet, that, too, is part of the journey. It is not a mistake. It is not a broken person. It is simply a car in the process of being assembled. And if one day they notice, "This is not me, this is my thought, but not my truth," then the next phase has already begun. Then, in the midst of chaos, something new emerges. It is not a thought, not a feeling, not fear. It is observation. A small inner voice, not one that says, "I want," but one that asks, "Who wants? Who is angry? Do I really have to do this?" This is a tiny seed of ego, not as pride, but as a structure that tries to bring order. The ego doesn't arrive as a conqueror. It arrives as a builder. In tech, the ego is the organizer of the psyche. When it is born, the psychological parts are like children in a schoolyard, each shouting, each pulling in a different direction, each demanding their way. And the ego says, "Listen to me. I'll give you space. I will hear you, but there will be order." And so begins the process of integration. First, it recognizes the parts. The relational part seeks recognition, power, and victory. The emotional part longs for love and security. The active part wants action, goals, achievement. The mental part strives to understand, explain, and control. The sensory part desires comfort, survival, and pleasure. At the beginning, these parts are stronger than the ego. When an emotion arises, it takes control of action, and the ego is pushed aside. Then the active part emerges. It seeks revenge, takes the wheel, and again, the ego can only watch. But the ego learns. It observes. It tries to regain control, not through force, but through inner authority. It begins to say, "I don't need to react immediately. I'll wait before I speak. This isn't my thought. It's fear speaking. I can choose differently." What happens next? As the ego gains strength, it begins to establish internal order. It becomes something like the director of the psychological team. Each part starts to have its function and begins to recognize the leadership of the ego. In a healthy psychological structure, where the ego is stable and has established internal order, every part of the psyche has its function, but does not take control. The sensory part is listened to, its experiences acknowledged, but it doesn't lead. The emotion is validated as a real feeling, but it doesn't decide on its own. Action is planned, not done impulsively under pressure from a drive. And the thought is analyzed, but the person does not fully identify with it. It is seen as one of many possible perspectives. In this way, the ego becomes a center that does not suppress, but organizes. Each part is important, but none is absolute. Subjective consciousness, the ego, begins to emerge as the team's director. For the first time, the person has an inner space from which they can choose. The end of phase 1, according to tech. The phase ends when all parts of the psyche have come under the ego's coordination. Not through suppression, but through alignment. Not through domination, but through organization. Each part receives its place and time, and the ego becomes a stable center, aware of itself, capable of managing the inner world. The process of forming conscious ego doesn't happen all at once. It is an inner path that begins with a simple but decisive realization. This is not me. This is my thought, my feeling, my impulse, but not my essence. That's the first step, distinguishing the I from my parts. Like a person finally seeing their reflection in the mirror and knowing that reflection is not all they are. Then comes observation. Quiet, without judgment. The ego begins to see the parts of the psyche as separate voices speaking within it. The voice that desires, the one that fears, the one that plans, the one that gets angry. And for the first time, It doesn't follow them blindly, but sees them as something it can listen to or decline. From that moment, responsibility for action begins. The person stops saying, "This happened to me," and starts asking, "How did I respond?" They stop blaming the world and begin to ask what they themselves contributed to their own reality. That's where true power is born, not through control over others, but through choosing one's inner posture. The next step is self-discipline, not as punishment, but as a loving agreement with oneself. To not react immediately, to allow space, to choose the best response, not the easiest one, to become the master of one's own time, speech, and steps. With time, the parts of the psyche begin to listen to each other. Integration does not mean the disappearance of drives, but their alignment. Each voice has its place, its value, but also its boundaries. Finally, when the ego no longer gets lost in emotions, thoughts, or impulses, but begins to set direction and order, an internal hierarchy is formed. Like an orchestra that finally has a conductor, where the instruments are not silenced, but guided. And then, for the first time, the human being not only has a psyche, but has a personality. No longer just psyche. No longer just instinct. No longer just reflex. But a centered structure with will, discipline, and choice. And right then, begins the second phase, when the ego becomes the ruler of the personality and starts to build its inner fortress. In the search for understanding the human psyche, two perspectives meet. Two perspectives meet, like two rivers flowing from different sources, yet toward the same destination. On one side stands Jung, the father of analytical psychology, who introduced to the world the concepts of archetypes, the collective unconscious, and the path toward individuation. On the other side is Tech, the theory of evolution of consciousness, which does not view the psyche as a mysterious depth, but as a structure of parts, of movements, and of clearly defined phases of development. Both agree on one essential truth. The psyche is not simple. It is composed of many inner forces. In Jung's framework, these forces appear as archetypes. The shadow, the repressed parts of the personality, anima animus, the inner feminine, masculine principle, and the self, the potential for wholeness. In Tech, the psyche is divided into functional structures. The emotional part, which feels, the relational part, which seeks connection, the mental part, which thinks, the active part, which acts, the sensory part, which perceives through the body, and the ego, which must organize them all. And here arises another key similarity. The ego is not everything. Jung says, the ego is just a small part of the entire psyche, the conscious part that experiences itself as I, but has no access to the larger internal reality. Tech says, the ego is subjective consciousness, but its task is not to dominate. It is to organize. It must recognize, distinguish, and integrate the other parts of the psyche. The ego is not the most important, but it is crucial, for without it, there is no order. And third, in both approaches, development does not begin with positive thoughts or meditation, but with confrontation. For Jung, this means meeting the shadow, that which we've repressed, denied, or are ashamed of. For Tech, it is the moment when the ego faces the chaos within its own psyche and begins to bring order. This is not me. This is a part of me. That is the first step on the path toward becoming a person. Although they begin with different concepts, Tech and Jung seek the same outcome: the integration of the human being. An awakened consciousness that looks inward and chooses. A personality that has not been lost in the shadows, but has brought them into light. That is the place where these two rivers merge into one sea of consciousness. CBT, through the lens of Tessie. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, although rooted in modern psychology, in fact supports the development of the ego, that is, subjective consciousness, in the first two phases of evolution, as described by the theory of evolution of consciousness, TEC. CBT does not aim to transform the personality or to reach the soul. Instead, it operates on a lower but essential level to activate the ego as a decision-making center. When a person, despite panic or fear, acts against the automatic impulse, they take the first step in differentiating between the self and the psychological parts. That is the beginning of a process where the conscious ego begins to discipline and coordinate the inner life. In this way, CBT encourages the formation of inner structure and will, both essential conditions for the development of subjective consciousness, in phase 1 of TEC. Though the method is not sufficient for deep transformation, its value lies in breaking the identification with the impulse and in stimulating the ego to take control. How to recognize someone in phase 1 of consciousness development. You can often notice that such a person reacts rather than chooses. They act under the influence of immediate emotion, impulse, or habit, without taking time to reflect. You may notice that they don't think about the consequences of their actions. Everything they feel in the moment is instantly turned into behavior. Then you might see that they lack the concept of an inner world. To them, what they feel is absolute reality. If they feel fear, they say, "You scared me," not, "I feel afraid." If someone upsets them, they believe that person is entirely responsible for their inner state. There is no distinction between outer events and inner experience. Next, you may observe that they don't differentiate between impulse and identity. If they want something, they believe it must be right, because they identify fully with the desire. They may say, "I want this, therefore it must be right." And if someone disagrees, they feel personally attacked, not merely challenged. Often you'll notice that they behave differently in different situations, as if they don't have a stable behavioral pattern. One day they're kind and charming. The next, they're irritable or withdrawn. Their behavior changes depending on which psychological part is active at the time: emotional, sensory, active, without a central coordinator. You can also see that the person does not have a stable ego. They don't show internal consistency or a sense of, "This is who I am." They are easily thrown off by external pressure, quickly identify with whatever impulse arises, and follow it without regulation, as if they have no inner filter or willpower to say, "No." Finally, you'll notice that their feelings and thoughts control them, not the other way around. They are emotionally unstable, ecstatic one day, crushed the next. They are easily offended, and their emotional state changes depending on what someone says or how someone looks at them. Everything external immediately affects their internal experience. All of these traits indicate that the person has not yet formed a stable ego. They are not a centered person, but rather a mosaic of impulses, emotions, and thoughts without a unifying core. This doesn't mean they are bad. It simply means they are in the natural first phase of the development of consciousness. And when the day comes that they ask, "Wait, is this really me?" then they are already approaching the next step. If this video opened up a new angle of thought for you, or gave you clarity about something you felt for a long time but couldn't quite explain, then I invite you to join this journey through the evolution of consciousness. Subscribe to the channel, because we're only beginning to dive into the phases, struggles, transformations, and real turning points of the inner world. In the comments, share. When was the first time you felt that you had an inner space from which you could observe? Or, have you ever noticed a part of you taking over, and only later thought, "That wasn't really me"? Every thought, every question, helps us refine this map. This isn't just theory, it's a co-creation. I'll be reading all your comments, And maybe your question will become the topic of a future video. I'll be waiting for you in that space where consciousness is built, part by part. Until the next video, observe, recognize, and don't forget, you are not your impulse. You are the one who sees.